What I'm going to try and do in this talk is really make some connections between various 19th century radical groups. In terms of academic history, academic historians are often quite keen on breaking periods into very specific chunks and emphasising the particularity of that particular movement, that particular period, rather than looking at a sort of very broad brush, broad view of history. But I think that sometimes diminishes the extent of kind of sympathy or continuity between movements, which is also an important aspect to consider. And obviously one of the things that you're always doing is teaching these second-order concepts of continuity and change, getting students to think about what stayed the same, what changed. So I hope it'll be useful in that regard as well. So I want to begin. I'll talk for about, I guess, 40-45 minutes, and hopefully there's some time at the end there if you've got any questions you want to ask me. But I want to begin with a sort of, well, it's almost a health warning here in terms of thinking about radicalism in the long view, thinking about the history of radicalism in Britain. And the thing to say here is that, first of all, this label, radicalism, only really came to be used in a political context in the 19th century. So the word is used in the English language before then, but it doesn't have the same connotations that it had and has now. Okay, so we tend to associate radicalism with dramatic change, with proposing dramatic change, perhaps with extreme opinions. Before the 19th century, when people mentioned radical, they meant going back to the roots, they meant fundamental. So they meant something quite different from the idea of doing something transformative and particularly novel. So it's only in the very late 18th and early 19th century that it comes to be a term that's used in a political context and referring to kind of radical political proposals for the fundamental transformation of the political landscape in Britain. And the French historian Elie Halévy assigned it particularly to the post-Peterloo era, so after 1819 in England, although we can find some references earlier in the 1790s. We particularly find this phrase combining radicalism and reform, radical reform, as something that crops up quite frequently in political discussions in that decade. And just to give you an example of this, I have this George Cruikshank image. It's actually from 1819, illustrating that point. Here we've got the figure of radical reform on his cape there, assaulting the figure of Britannia, who is trying to defend herself with the laws, and she's protecting the rock of religion there, and you can see that the British line is coming to her aid, rushing to her aid. And we've got a whole set of it's too low quality, I'm afraid, this picture, but behind radical reform there's a whole set of other sort of demonic-looking figures carrying other radical demands behind them. So we get this sort of sense here of the threat of radicalism. You might also notice here, a bit naughty, this rather phallic arrow emerging from the groin of radical reform there. So we get a sense here of Britannia under threat here, Britannia being assaulted. So this poses some problems, the fact that radicalism only really has currency as a political term in British politics, British history, in the 19th century. If we start tracking it back further than that, we can get into some difficulties there in terms of anachronism, in terms of adopting a view that historians might describe as being traditionalist. So you can get into the trap, if you like, of seeing radicalism as unchanging, of viewing this radical tradition which is being passed down from one group to another like a kind of baton race, you know. So the people at Peterloo pass it on to the Chartists, who then pass it on to the suffragettes, and we sort of suggest that this is all continuous and there's no sort of difference in terms of what radicalism is over that 100-year period. And equally, we can be seen as conferring sort of that same level of consistency, not just upon groups, but upon individuals as well. So we can identify people as being a radical, and then that's what they are for the rest of their lives. But one of the important things about radicalism, I would say, is that of course it's dependent upon context and circumstances. Because what happens to be radical in one particular moment, decades later, can be the political consensus, can be political orthodoxy. So it's dependent, radicalism is dependent on its relationship with the political mainstream, and what's radical in one moment might later on be perfectly orthodox, perfectly part of a political consensus.